Good morning. That was easy. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me? We won't ask this at every event, but since it's the first event of the fair, I have to make sure we're doing this right. Well, it's lovely to see you all for the first event of the fair at the Translation Centre. My name is Daniel Hahn, and I'm the Programme Director of the British Centre for Literary Translation. And we're here to talk about we're calling it Publishers' Resources for National Publishers' Resources for National Literatures, which is not a terribly catchy title. But the idea is that we wanted to look at some of the resources produced which are trying to promote specifically books from one language or one country. We have three people who are going to be talking about a few different models that exist from different countries in Europe. Before they do that, I'm just going to race through a few examples, just so that you have a sense of sort of what the range is of existing publications. And then I'm going to hand over to Rosie, who's going to lead the proper discussion. So what you're going to get from me is a very, very high speed, not terribly interesting, but I hope quite useful view of about a dozen of the publications that already exist. I should say this is a dozen of a very, very large number, so we're not by any means showing you the full field, as it were, but just a few to give you a sense of the range. There is the Estonian Literary Magazine, which is a print publication, comes out twice a year, which has extensive profiles of Estonian writers, bibliographies, and a number of features, lists of books that have been published, translated from Estonian, and introductions to a small number of recent books. We have Slovak, little demonstration copies. Slovak Literary Review, again a print publication, again published twice a year, published by the Centre for Information on Literature. It includes extracts, translated extracts of work by about 10 writers, prose and poetry, translated some of them into English and some of them into German, and a number of book reviews occasionally as well. Excuse me. Right. Try again. Excellent. There we are. New Books in German is another print publication, again produced twice a year. A lot of the ones which are produced twice a year you'll find are produced around this time of year in October to tie in with the London and the Frankfurt book fairs. There seems to be a relatively regular model. New Books in German has been around for some time. They're now on issue number 31. They cover new books from 3 countries, all books from German, so books from Germany, Austria and Switzerland. What's interesting about this one is that the books are selected by a local panel. There's a panel in the UK, local experts who select the books. About 30 or 40 titles each issue, fiction, non-fiction, poetry and children's books, plus feature articles, grant information. They've also, I think, which is interesting, they've set up an emerging translators program where they've started commissioning work from, I'm not keeping up, they've started commissioning work from new translators. New Spanish Books is only an online publication. Like the others, it's twice a year, published for London and Frankfurt. Like New Books in German, it's selected by a small local panel, so it's local experts in the UK who select specifically with an eye to what is going to work in the UK market. About a dozen titles each time, and the website includes the reader's reports which are produced on each of the books, so there's a fairly thorough critical analysis of each of the books selected in each round of New Spanish Books. 10 books from Slovenia. This one includes 10 books from Slovenia. Who knew, right? 10 books. It's published by the Centre for Slovenian Literature. It includes biographical information about writers, synopses, and a translated excerpt from each. About half of the publications we're talking about actually include translated samples. Half of them do not. New Books from Poland. We're about halfway there. New Books from Poland. A print publication produced by the Polish Book Institute. Each issue includes about 15 books, again, with sample translations and information about publisher contact. Fiction France is produced by the Institut Français. It's been going since about 2007. Again, twice a year. Each time they recommend about 20 titles, all fiction, as the name suggests, with quite significant translated samples. contemporary Bulgarian writers was one of the ones which I think was a revelation to quite a few of us who hadn't seen it before and discovered it in the last few days and thought, this is really good. Contemporary Bulgarian Writers is an online publication. It's all living writers of fiction. It includes profiles of writers, interviews and synopses and that sort of thing, but also quite a lot of actual translated text. There's quite a lot of material on the site, so people can get a sense of what this writing is like. Transcript is another online one. It's an online magazine produced by Literature Across Frontiers. It's published, I think uniquely, all of it's published in 3 languages, in English, French and German. Most issues focus on a particular country or a particular theme, and it's a showcase of translated writing, translated into those 3 languages, prose and poetry. The most recent issue, the issue which is online now, is the Malta issue. It's writing from Malta. Then we have new Czech fiction from 2010-2011. It's 2 years of Czech fiction produced by the Czech Ministry of Culture. It includes a little bit of information, doesn't include samples, but a little bit of information about 50 or so titles. It's bilingual in English and German. Presumably, again, this is something to do with a sense of it being used for Frankfurt as well. And alongside that, we just wanted to mention the Czech Literature Portal, which is information on writers. The whole site is in English and Czech, and this is just an online resource. I'm running out of breath. New Catalan fiction. Print publication produced by the Institut Ramon Llull. Information about 11 books. This is New Catalan Fiction 2011-2012. Short sample translations, and it's about recent publications by Catalan writers, and it does, like a number of these, include information about available grants for people who might be interested in publishing these books in translation. Swedish Book Review is one of the most long-running of these publications. It's been going since 1983. There are 2 issues a year. It's edited by Sarah Death, who is right in the front there. It's edited by a translator, and it looks like that. It's edited by a translator, so we like that as well. And it features translated extracts of work by Swedish writers, and also occasional articles and reviews. Books from Finland is only online. It used to be in print as well. It's been going since 1967. And this is a journal for people who are interested in Finnish literature, published by the Finnish Literature Society, supported by Fili. Reviews, profiles, and also, as many of these others, a showcase of the actual writing itself. I'm just going to show you one more thing before I finish, which is, I think, an interesting and different model, which might be something worth mentioning in the conversation. This is called Schwab, and this is produced by the Dutch Foundation for Literature. It's a relatively new initiative, and one of the reasons I thought this was interesting was because where all of the other things I've been talking about from these countries have been a country trying to promote their literature outwards, if you like. This is produced by the Dutch Foundation for Literature, trying to get more literature in. It's for inbound work. And so one of the questions I think it might be interesting to discuss is whether there is actually a role for someone to think about how we look at how we can help things to come in rather than depending on everyone else pushing things out, if you like. This includes not just books from one country or one language. So this is about people in the Netherlands thinking about how they can give their publishers access to books they might be interested in publishing. Right, I'm going to sit down and take some deep breaths. I'm going to hand over to our chair, who is a broadcaster and a journalist and a great champion of European literature. She's running the European Literature Night, which I hope she will say something about. And she is also, I think, the best chair in the business. This is Rosie Goldsmith.
No pressure. Thank you, Danny, very much indeed. And make sure you keep that voice well tuned for the next few days. You've got 3 days of this, Danny. It is really great to see you all again. I know so many of you here, and I do feel very much at home when I'm here. And I want to thank, before we go any further, very much huge thanks to Daniel Hahn and to Alexandra Büchler as well for organising this session and setting us in the right direction, providing all these magazines and books and so on. We haven't had all of them, but we'll try our best. Now, I talk for a living, but these two actually have real power as far as books go. So I'm going to really try and guide them through this. I'm not a publisher, as you know. I'm just a journalist. So Bryony Everode on my right and Philip Gwyn-Jones. Now, Bryony is an editor at Harville Secker, part of the Random House Group, with a very special interest in translated fiction. She speaks French and some Spanish. In 2010, she founded the Harville Secker Young Translators Prize, and she'll have some exciting news about this year's prize this afternoon, so stay tuned. And Jo Nesbo and Karen Fossum are two of Bryony's great foreign author successors, so maybe we'll hear how she discovered them. Philip, who's hopefully got a voice, coughing away, is executive publisher at Granta Portobello, or is it Portobello Granta?
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, both ways. And I imagine you speak Welsh, as you come from there.
Some, yes.
And some French, I hear, and a bit of Italian. Now, Philip was also editor for 15 years with HarperCollins, but wherever he is in the book world and whatever his role, he is also committed to getting really good foreign fiction onto our bookshelves and our e-readers. Now, how do they spot their international writers, and what tools do they use, and to what extent do they use these tools? Now, we're going to discuss these magazines. We've been asked to be honest about them and to be critical, and we are going to be, because we think that's much more useful to you. And so forgive us if it's a little bit too critical, but you know, obviously there's some wonderful things to say as well. Now, first of all, Bryony and Philip, very generally, what is the overall aim of these magazines and these online publications? What purpose do they serve for you? Philip, give us a go.
Well, I think that varies. Some of them seem very... Sorry, is that all right? Some of them seem very specifically intent on informing you about a number of books from that particular season or that particular year, no more, no less. Some of them have a more of a magazine feel, especially some of the online ones, which of course have more room and are intent on giving you a sense of context and a sense of a survey of what's going on in the literary marketplace in question, some themes in publishing, some themes in the kinds of literature that's successful, and so on. So the range goes from the narrow to the quite broad.
Bryony, same for you? Or?
Yes, I mean, I think that's seems to have a similar purpose, and they all are quite different from each other. And I think also sometimes foreign agents can use them as a tool, and there are certain ones that have more of a catalog feel that to me feel more appropriate to that approach, that somebody is showing you this at a rights fair or so on and says, oh, look, and it's featured in this particular publication from our country, that's great. I feel some of them are more difficult to stand on their own as something that you would sit down and read.
Mm-hmm. Now we're going to discuss. It's going to be a bit like the pick of the papers. So it's going to be like a Sunday morning, sitting around with your cup of coffee. Make sure you're all relaxed, and we're going to pick out a few and talk about them. But I want to tell you the criteria that we are using for this, because I think that's only fair that you know. And it's not all about how they look, even though I'm very tempted to go for the graphics and the visuals, the fashion statement of these magazines, if you like. But the two criteria, the two main intellectual criteria for these guides are how interesting and effective they are in conveying information about the contemporary literary scene of a country. That's very clear. And the second thing is, how effective are they in capturing the interest of the publisher, looking for interesting titles in comparison with other tools, say literary agents and other magazines or catalogues. And some of the ideas are, we're going to look at them visually, the author's pictures, the biogs, the graphics, the information, the rights issues, translation, articles and the features round the subject, the data that they provide, the paper, the grammar and the quality of the English, how they're selected, the panel, the age of a publication, the trust and the editorial voice, if you like, as well, and whether they appear often enough, too little, that kind of thing. Now, we need to remind you that these are, you've spent a lot of time producing these magazines. They are, on the whole, wonderful and serve a very, very good purpose, but this is a marketplace and they're competing with one another. You're competing for their attention, so that's partly what we're going to be talking about, is when they work in the marketplace. Now, shall we start with let's start with this one, and this is random, but we've all looked at this one. Philip, could you chat with us about that one? And then join in Brian.
I think before we start on the specifics, one thing I want to say is that I understand certainly that most of these magazines and online initiatives are produced for an international audience using English as the medium. So we're not so arrogant as to presume that these are only for us here in the UK, just in case you're worried about the usual British arrogance. But even so, I think that they have to work in English because they're written in English before all, and it's something we might talk about later about the importance of that and the quality of the prose. I think of that particularly, I'm afraid, if we can start by being bluntly honest, with this, the Slovak one, which where for me, the quality of the English itself is not sufficiently high to deliver the message that it wants to deliver. So I personally think, and I don't know what the others think.
Just hold this one
sorry,
up a little bit.
Yep. Show and tell.
Show and tell, absolutely. We're rifling through the papers here, but
it's half. I can't speak for the quality of the German. I have to say half of it's in German. It features about 6 or 7 individual projects, some poetry, some fiction, and has a range of extracts as well as analysis of the biographical details of the writers, and it's quite comprehensive. It's one of the more comprehensive in its presentation of each individual writer or project, and that's one way of being. I don't think that's a good or a bad thing. Some of our catalogues here are very brief and concise. Some give you more. I don't think there is a right way, but I do think that whichever way you go, the way in which you write in English, at least, matters hugely. And this one, particularly for me, fell down on the quality of its English.
We all felt that, didn't we? That the English is absolutely essential. I mean, Brian, we won't dwell too much on each one, but what did you feel about this one in particular?
Yeah, can I?
Yeah.
I mean, I liked, for me, apart from the English, I mean, it's very dense. I think it's lovely, but it kind of has, you just have a name, you have an author name and a piece, and then, sorry, that's actually not right, that is an essay.
But it's a very long
But it's a very long piece. I like that you kind of pull out great quotes from the books. That has an immediacy which I really like. But it's just every inch of the page is filled, and I think rather than having pulled out some particular salient details, particular biographical details, would have been better than cramming everything onto that. So for me, it doesn't feel very easy to get into.
To be positive about it, one thing I think it does do well is that it focuses in on a relatively small number of projects.
Yeah.
And again, this is a general point I would make. I think in that regard, less is more. And however good the publication is, if it produces in each individual issue 24 new projects for you, the receiving publisher, to assess, I think it's overdoing it.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid each of those projects probably suffers by being one of too many. So
agree.
focusing harder is, I would say, valuable.
Very useful. Now let's go to, this is just arbitrary, go to the Catalan. Would you like to start off talking about that?
This is lovely, I have to say. Not only because it's got lovely production values, but again, to Philip's point, it focuses on just a small number of titles, which I think is really well done. You've got a blurb here. You've got other works by the author and where else it has been translated. And then you've got a very short extract just to give you a flavor of the book. And in the middle, you have a kind of showcase of where Catalan fiction has been published recently and some of the titles that have been a success. And so I think it's really, really, really nicely done. You agreed with that, I believe?
I would agree with all of that, and I think that, again, that's one general point worth making about, at the back, the sort of the showcasing of recent publications from the language in languages other than English, elsewhere, with details. It's done there. Is a really good thing, generally, to have information about where the writer in question has been published already. with
Does
previous
it
books.
influence you when you're choosing books where it's been published already?
I think it's all part of, it's not decisive, but it's all part of accruing a sense of the writer's importance. It's hard to dismiss someone if they've been published already in 25 languages and by, you know, notable publishers in each of those languages. So you can't help but be impressed by that.
What about if prizes and awards are listed? Does that influence you as well? I mean, many of them do list the awards, or most of them do, in fact.
I think that's really helpful. I mean, I think sometimes when you're buying it, a book, there's a question over how much that's going to mean to a UK audience, but that's kind of a question for further down the road. I think when you're sharing, because one of the things that's really important, I think, to remember is that one of the reasons, I'm not defending it, but that it can be tricky to convince colleagues to publish books in translation is that they can't get their hands on material. And so the more information they have and the more bits that you can shout about, the better. So I think having literary prizes is really helpful. And again, it suggests a certain degree of importance of the book before you...
And I mean, there is, you know, to be honest, there is a problem if you've got the list of other translated literature, you know, translated into the Albanian as the, you know, the only other one. And I don't know whether, you know, these days, of course, you need more, don't you, than just that, because these are all competing for your attention. Or would you rather have that information or not have that information? If it's...
I think it's useful to have the information if it's succinctly presented.
The use of the adjectives that are used. I mean, how often have you read compelling, groundbreaking, and so on and so forth?
Oh, well, that's a problem in English too.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's what I mean. But that's an issue, isn't it? That's an issue.
Yeah.
It is an issue, though, isn't it? How you describe these books. Because if you look across, say, this too, I looked at the adjectives in New Books in German. You know how they were describing the books. It's, you know, very well written, but there is a lot of the, you know, finding other ways to describe books is very, very important, and in reviews, of course, as well. Let me talk briefly about this one. This is one I know very well. I've been following for a number of years. And this is, if I just give a little bit of background, I think, to how this particular magazine is put together, because I happen to know, and I think it actually helps us to understand how the others work or don't work. Now, all of us on the whole like this one a lot. We've got a few reservations, but what happens with this, and right at the front of this, is information for editors. Now, as far as I know, this is the first time this has been put right at the front, and I actually welcome that. I thought that was a very honest and clear mission statement of how the books are selected and how, and the fact that the translators, the grants are guaranteed, and so on. Now, this is with thanks to Katie Derbyshire, who you might know as a translator. She wrote a blog about New Books in German, and she was actually in on one of the editorial processes, which I haven't attended. But what happens is that this is funded by Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. So they're German language books, basically. It's edited by Charlotte Ryland. So there is a strong editor's voice right at the front, and Charlotte is, you know, very much present there as well. The idea is, the way it works for all of these magazines, I think it's worth mentioning, is that the publishers send the best of their crop from, in this case, children's, young adults, fiction, non-fiction and fiction, to New Books in German. A team of experts then selects about average 70 titles, I think, and they then decide what they think will work on the British market. So by the time that you read this, there's already been a very stringent selection process by experts. So you can sort of relax in that sense that these are good books that have been selected. The New York office is also part of this now too, so you've got American and British publishers here addressed in the same magazine. And the kinds of issues that are discussed at these meetings, I think, is also very important. This is what Katie Derbyshire was also writing about. Now, that's important too, I think, when you choose these books, because what is going to work on a British market? You've got, is it too German? Is a book too German? How often can you present a book about the Nazis, for instance, or long dead political systems to foreign countries? I mean, how much interest is there in communism anymore? You know, does a runaway success in Germany actually make it in the UK? Is it the same kind of book? And do we care anymore, as Katie Derbyshire says, about experimental fiction? Do we like all those things in the UK? And is it too top-heavy on the crime front? Do we automatically go for crime novels? Okay, now those are some of the issues. Any thoughts on those particularly, and on this particular magazine?
Well, for me, one of the most important things about what you're talking about there, about the process of the German selection, and I think it applies almost equally to the Spanish selection too. I think the Spanish was actively modelled on the German, and I've participated actually in both of them.
Oh, have you?
Because they have a culture of biodiversity in that they rotate the people mostly. I mean, they're a core team, but every selection panel has one publisher, one bookseller, one scout, one agent, and they're different each time. I've done the German twice and the Spanish once, and I think that's extremely healthy. They're also completely transparent about who it is, and without being too Leninist about everything, you want to know who's in power. You want to know who has the power of selection, and they name them in the German selection, and they name them in the Spanish selection, whereas some of the others may well be chosen by entirely estimable people, but you don't know who they are, and I think that gives you pause as a receiving publisher.
Bryony, how do you feel about this one in particular? And from certain other aspects, it's got a lot of articles, features, reviews.
I really like this one very much. I mean, I think there's always going to be a certain element of personal preference, and I think that I sort of lean towards the more magazine-style format as something that is easier to dip into. I really, really like it. I like the fact that the kind of different genres are very clearly labelled. It is...
Can you hold it up if you...
Yes, sorry. You have the genres labelled down here, and even though it is a fairly substantial magazine, there you would know, if you were just a crime fiction editor, for instance, you would go, okay, I'm in a rush, but I'll flip to the crime and thriller section and just read those. Or if you don't like any of these particular genres, then you leave them alone. I like that kind of... It feels easy to navigate. And again, you have a mix of presenting new titles and also recent titles that have been published in English and so on. So it does feel like a broad range. And so I'm speaking to the point about kind of giving a sense of the contemporary literary scene. I think it does that really well because it gives a broader picture rather than just focusing on specific titles.
Any reservations about this one?
Well, if I'm really, really harsh, possibly that it's got a little, by my standards, because I've got a very short attention span, a little too long of late. I mean, it seems to be expanding, which is, a good thing in all sorts of ways, and there's a lot of interesting things coming out of German literature right now, so it's completely legitimate. But I do worry that I might miss the odd thing because there's so much.
It is more like a literary review now. It's a combination between a literary review and a useful guide to publishers.
Yeah.
I mean, I quite like that because I'm not in your business, but I like reading the articles. But there are a lot, and they do seem to increase. Appearance.
I think it's fabulous. I'm not sure about the cover as being the most appealing thing in the world, but I like the insides very much.
I judge these things totally by colour and fashion. But
I think it's fine. It does the job.
Fine.
It does the job. It's very true.
Good. Well, we won't stay. But that was really to give you an example of what we think is a good one and how it actually works, how this process actually works. Before we move on to a few more general points, I think we should talk about the Czech one because that's an interesting book as well. Philip, if you could start us off on that one.
Well, the Czech is like the Catalan in that they're both on a very different rhythm. They're produced, if I understand them correctly, every other year. So you have 2 years' worth of production from those two smaller, dare I say that, literary cultures. But I think they're both incredibly well focused. The Czech one very much takes the approach of just giving you a very small, you probably can't see from here, but again, it's bilingual. So you have, this is a German paragraph, and that's the English translation of same. It's a small survey of that writer, who they are, why they're important, what this particular book is, where it sits in their oeuvre, all done in 4 sentences, which is quite remarkable. And it's extremely well written in terms of the English, at least. I can't speak for the German. So I was very impressed by this, but I'd never seen it before, which brings us to another point.
Very good. Thank you. We're working well together here. How do we get hold of these publications? Bryony, what would be the absolute ideal way for you to get hold of all of this? I do want to talk about the online magazines as well, by the way, in a minute, but we get these by chance.
Again, I think it does come down to personal preference. I don't think there is necessarily an ideal way to get things to different types of publishers. People work very differently. I think having some things in print is fantastic. For me, there are some really, just to talk for a second about the websites, really, really fantastic one. I especially like the books from Finland. If that was sent to me just as a link saying, here are some new books from Finland, here's a link, go to the website. This sounds so lazy, but there's something about that that's not very immediate. If you had a newsletter that then said, here's an article, or here's a particular author we're talking about, find out more about them here, you think, oh, okay, they're sort of inviting you to browse. And I think that's much more successful.
Which the Icelandic Foundation does. I don't know if you get the Icelandic one. They send out a sort of small email bulletin, I think on a quarterly basis. Literature from Iceland, it'll have 2 stories, as it were, in its email with HTML emails with video and pictures as well. So I think that's what you're saying. So they do that, and then you click through, and then lo and behold, you're in a translation survey.
So the portal really is how you get to it. Is very. I mean, that sounds like a very, very good way to get access and to be informed.
But to show how random it is, I've published 2 Czech authors at Portobello in the last couple of years. I have very good relations with the Czech Cultural Centre here in London, and Renato, I don't think, is here.
I haven't seen any of the Czechs today, actually.
But I've never.
Hello, Czechs.
But I've never seen this or heard of it, and I've never seen it. Is this the first one? Oh, thank God for that. Okay, I feel better now.
We haven't missed previous ones. It is excellent. Yes.
Phew. Okay. No offence meant, because it's very, very good. But how the national bodies find the likes of me and Bryony and others here in the UK and indeed in other countries around the world is a fairly big issue.
Yes, and I think one of the other points that we touched on briefly is we're used to doing books in translation, so we're one set of publishers who are quite familiar with the process, but then there are a whole other set of publishers who are not so used to it, who presumably you'd like to target. And so I think the thing to bear in mind is just the kind of the enormous volume of emails and, in fact, brochures and things that come through, and just, again, trying to make it as focused as possible. I mean, I think that's a lot of what we're coming back to, is just if you have these 2 titles or these 2 authors to focus on, you look at it immediately, you think, oh, yes, that is for me, I'll find out more about it. Or you think, oh, maybe this one isn't, but I'll look out for the next issue. And then you've dealt with it. Rather than if you were faced with a giant catalog or a list, you're going to feel overwhelmed by it and possibly not really look at it straight away.
It's an enormous expense to produce these publications. I imagine, I don't know what any of the figures are, but does it show when the money has been spent on them, and does it matter to you?
Are we back on design now?
No. Back on all kinds of issues. Editorial, obviously graphic is important, but the photographs, all these different issues, the data that's included, the features. I mean, should they be spending money on them? In other words,
I don't think that's necessarily about expense. That's just about good clarity of design and having, I suppose, paying the money, therefore, to have someone with proper design knowledge lay the thing out. New Books in German isn't the world's most stylish magazine, but the way the information is structured on the page is peerlessly good. So it does its job extremely well. And I suppose there's the issue about whether you need to be as stylish as the Catalans to be as effective as the Germans. And they're just 2 different. Perhaps it's all down to national stereotypes. Sorry, but you just need to convey the information as clearly and comprehensively and effectively as possible. That's the first goal. Design, quality of paper, quality of production values. That's a secondary one, I would argue.
Fine, fair enough. I was just going to point out that one thing that this is not about design. This is actually a very simple issue, I think, but it's how the photographs are portrayed. Now, I notice in New Books in German there is a huge variety, and all these different, a huge variety of the way the photographs are presented in the magazine. Now, this, you know, the new Catalan fiction. These are not the best quality of photographs, but the way they are displayed is fantastic, and there's a uniform process for the different authors. If you can see, they're all displayed in that similar strip way, and I just think it works really well. There's a uniformity to the whole thing.
Rosie is a sucker for layout, as you can see.
There you are. You can see at least somebody is picking up the layout here. Now, I want to talk very briefly about some of the other online magazines. We touched on Bulgaria. Now, we all saw Bulgaria very late in the day yesterday, but we were pretty much bowled over by it. This is a new online magazine. Thank you, Danny, for keeping up with us here. It is a very impressive online magazine. Do have a look at it. Any of you want to have a little...
No, I was, again, hugely impressed, and I think none of us had actually seen it before or knew of its existence, so we're back in that lovely phase of first love. But it's reminiscent of some of the other very good sites, like I would say the Dutch site. The Dutch is not here, but the Dutch for me have always been in many ways the model of how this is done best. They produce a catalogue twice a year on the usual rhythm before the fairs of 10 books from Dutch in fiction and 10 in non-fiction, no more than 10. And I think that's to be emulated, frankly. And then online you have the whole archive of each of those publications, plus much deeper, richer content about the individual authors, brilliantly organized. And the Bulgarians seem, I don't know whether they're consciously or not, to have modeled themselves on the Dutch site, and to have this very rich plethora of information about individual books, individual authors, the context, magazine articles, magazine type articles, survey articles about the state of literature in Bulgaria at the minute, and also publishing matters and so on. So really impressive.
That's great. Anything you want to say about that one, or can we just?
No, I think carry on.
Yeah,
we really like that.
Let's. There are a few that we online. We've been looking at new Spanish books, as we've been saying, books from Finland, the Swedish book review as well, which is now online, which is also edited by Sarah Diaz. And now that replicates the print issue exactly, doesn't it? It's a selection, okay.
One thing we mentioned about the Swedes that they do better than anyone else is reviewing. Half the magazine perhaps is given over to proper orthodox reviews of recent publications, which have, you know, the quality and the kind of authority really of newspaper reviews. You don't feel that you're reading someone. Some of them are quite negative in their ways. You know, they're honest and absolutely plausible. So that's one approach that the Swedes take that I don't think many of the others do, actually having full-length reviews.
No, I don't think so.
New Spanish Books, as we've been saying, is a fantastic site. It's not a pretty site. Not that that shouldn't matter, but sorry.
It doesn't function very well.
And it doesn't function
more
very well.
importantly.
I have a few problems with that site.
I think they need to spend some money on web architecture.
Thank you. Absolutely. Now, on the sites, you open yourself up, of course, to much more exposure. You have the news, you have archive and so on up there. You have blogs. I would just say, too, I checked for the news sites and the press. They were very much out of date. Very few of them did have up-to-date news. And I think if you're going to offer a news portal, do make it up to date. Otherwise, you're opening yourself up to problems, I think. Did you feel that as when you were looking?
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think again, I think it may have been the Finnish site. I thought was very good on having all of the social media links and RSS feeds and all kinds of things available, which I think is important if you want to spread the word and for different types of publishers and different people exploring books. I think just do everything you can in that way.
I subscribed for the RSS feed straight away.
Did you?
Yeah.
We are missing quite a few, not just physically. We would actually, all of us, we would like to have other magazines and publications that would help, I think. For instance, the Italians. There is no Italian review.
Where are the Italians?
Where are the Italians?
Are they here? No.
It is... Now, I mean, it's difficult then for you to make a choice, a fair choice across the board if you don't have all these national literatures presented to you. Or do you just rely on other tools, or not even bother translating or using Italian books?
Well, this brings us back to first principles, and the point of these initiatives is to excite the interest of someone like Brian or someone like me here in the UK or in Germany or in America or South Africa, where it might be, and that's the job they're setting out to do. If they're doing it well, then undoubtedly more books will get translated from that language. If they're not doing it at all, like the Italians, then arguably fewer books than should be translated, certainly into English, are getting translated. But of course, there are other ways. And, we publishers have the international network that this book fair represents, and we have our Italian friends as well as those from these countries that produce the catalogues.
I think I still feel in many ways these are tools, and that really the relationships that you have with those publishers or those cultural organizations. I mean, I'm going to feel terrible if I've got this wrong, but I'm not sure, for instance, that Norla puts out anything in print or and they must have it online, but I mean, but Norway. Norla.
They have an email.
They have a very good
yes. But they have such a fantastic organization in terms of making contacts and keeping you up to date about what's happening in their country and inviting publishers to visit, and they're in a privileged position to do that. But they're absolutely excellent at that. So I think even if I'm not getting a magazine from them, I still know what's going on.
Could you do without these magazines?
Do without them? Well,
it's a shame.
Clearly, in the case of the Italians, yes, we can, because we're translating books from Italian without them. But it would be better if there were one.
So the idea, the message then from both of you is that it's a collection of tools that you use in order to get your books. I mean, if we just take Jo Nesbø, and you were talking about the Norwegians. I mean, Jo Nesbø is one of your great.
I have to confess it wasn't me.
Wasn't you? But how did Harald Secker then discover Jo Nesbø?
Through a network of lots and lots of people, and Don Bartlett, who's Nesbø's translator, was one of the people, I believe, who was saying to various people at Harville, you have to publish this person. And then a lot of different nags from different directions, and then then we worked on him. But that was kind of a different time, actually. I think that was when really relatively few people were discovering, or maybe not relatively few, that's not fair, but I think people have woken up to translated fiction in a new way in the past few years.
Philip, is there an example where you've actually used these magazines to publish?
There are examples where the first time I've come across a book that I've gone on to publish has been in one of these magazines, yes, in the Dutch and in the German, I would say, particularly, because they've been going longest, as it were.
I'm actually interviewing one of your authors, Peter Stamm, on Friday, and I first heard of him through New Books in German, and that's just on a journalistic level as well, so that was useful for me. I don't know, where did you hear about him?
Actually, in that particular case, he already had a publisher in the US, so it was more of a purchase from the US publisher. But I think the US publisher in the first place got wind of his writing from New Books in German, so it's the same end result, as it were.
Indeed. Now we'd like to open it up a little bit to all of you. So we've got a microphone there, and do feel free to ask anything about anything to either of these panelists. So, Charlotte, if you want to take Charlotte Ryland.
Yeah. Oh, it is working. Hi, thanks very much. That was extremely interesting. Danny mentioned quite a lot in his introduction about samples available on either in print or online, and I was wondering if you could say something about how useful samples are to you and what is useful about them.
Sample translations,
yes.
Excerpts. I think this is quite subjective. Personally, I'm not a big fan of that necessarily. I don't think that's decisive. I don't think, because inevitably what you're reading by way of a sample is very short, and therefore that extract has an immense burden on it to represent the book as a whole, and it can't be done. Like many other aspects of the information you're given, it can be useful, it can be interesting, but it certainly isn't central in my evaluation.
I think they're really useful, but I would agree about that there is a huge burden on that book that you may sort of dismiss it on the basis of that, and it'd be very, very hard to get that right.
Yeah.
I do think they're really useful, and I think they're especially useful at the stage where you would be sharing them with colleagues and acquiring the book. Again, coming back to our point that we were talking about before, quality of that sample translation is really important. However much you realize that you shouldn't pay attention to the English if you end up having a different translator, for instance, you do think it can influence your reading of the text, however much you try not to let it.
Okay, thank you. And here, lady at the front here. Can you take the microphone? Yeah, thank you.
I just wondered, how interested are you in books which are not new? Are you interested in re-editions or reissues of classics?
Do you mean as portrayed in these?
It's a very good point, I think. Very good point. And I would say very, because as you can see, the somewhat random way in which we get to hear about the best of this past year from certain countries means that we could blink and miss a whole year's worth of great publishing from one language culture. So to have a spotlight shone on something really significant that for whatever reason didn't get into English, but comes from 5 years ago or 15 years ago or 55 years ago is a very healthy thing.
And there is a section in some of the
Germans do it very well.
A forgotten gem is called.
Charlotte does it very well.
But there, these are the ones we know, ones we've been given. There are other examples. So, did you want to talk about that, or are you?
Oh no,
happy to move?
Yeah.
Okay. And Nikki Harman at the back.
I wanted to ask how influenced you would be by seeing a profile of the author, assuming that in your online or paper magazine you found something, a sample or a review about a foreign author, and you've already said that you find it interesting to have news, to know where he's been translated or she's been translated. But what about a profile? Does it influence you at all to know any more, in a more rounded way, about the author?
Bryony.
Ooh. Nice. That's the end of your question. Yeah, I think they're really helpful, again, if they're succinctly presented. I think falling into the trap of listing every title that author has ever done, if they've done a lot, or years of publication and things like that really clutter up the narrative of a biography, aren't useful. But I think a little bit of their background is really interesting. Maybe they have an interesting life story, or nice to know what their background was, whether they're a journalist or done something completely different, or I think that helps give a flavor of it. But I think still the book is really what you should be judging. But I think it's helpful as long as it's neatly and focused.
Thank you. And gentleman at the front here.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. I'm just interested to know how interested you are in learning more about and in publishing literatures from Asia, and how you go about collecting information on those books.
This is a very European
session. Can I just point out, and I should have mentioned this right at the beginning, that we were asked just to look at European books. So I'm sorry about that if there was a misunderstanding about that. We are very interested in Asian literature. A very quick answer on that, but then we will get back to the European. Yeah.
No, very, very.
Yes.
And there are many new initiatives out of Asia particularly which are really excellent and long overdue. So, yeah. Same principles apply, though.
No, our fault, not yours. Thank you for asking. And you wanted a question, and then there's Sarah at the front here as well. Thank you.
You mentioned that for some of the magazines and probably for some of the websites, a panel of British editors and publishers sort of work or help to choose the titles. Does it happen for every language? How would you go to attract the editors or journalists or anybody who could be on this kind of panel if you are a foreign publisher or an agent?
I think we'd probably have to ask somebody who actually produces those magazines. But on the whole, I understand that there is a panel, that there's no one person deciding which books go into these.
I think, for instance, New Spanish Books was one I've participated in before. There's kind of a core rotation of people who are involved
you
in
were
that, and
talking
they just
about as
know
well.
quite a lot of people in the book industry, and they just recommend different people. And they also, this is terrible, they also give us lunch. That's a terrible thing to say.
I thought it was
no,
apple
but it's a
strudel.
very pleasant, it's a really interesting thing to do. I loved being part of that panel because it just kind of, as a publisher, it just made you feel a greater connection with the country, and also was just really fascinating. So I think it's just finding one person who works in the industry would be a good start for that.
And that's an experience that Philip was speaking about earlier as well, too, being on the panel. It was good for both sides.
Absolutely, yeah. But as far as I know, it is only the Spanish and the Germans that at the moment at least conduct themselves that way, which I think is your question.
Sarah from Swedish.
Oh, she's
Just wanted to ask, would you have time to do more? Because, well...
I see.
Where are you from, actually?
Russia. So,
Russia.
yeah,
Do you produce a magazine like this in English?
Yes, there are a few initiatives, probably not
because I haven't seen any. It would be great if there were one from Russia. They really would.
I think, personally, I would say that there are probably enough people to go around who would be interested in doing it,
Yeah,
so I don't think
definitely.
that's a problem. Because I think people are naturally curious, especially if you're doing these kind of books, you're curious to know about these countries, and so...
And as you can see, every editor likes a free lunch.
Yeah.
Or apple strudel. Now, Sarah, you had a question as well. Maybe you can just answer that too. Do you have a panel of people working on the Swedish book review, which is Sarah Diath edits that?
No, we don't have the resources to do that, I'm afraid. And also our history is rather different. We developed out of, well, we're supported by the Swedish Arts Council, but they like us to be entirely editorially independent. They think we can be, as you said, more plausible that way. We can do the odd honest negative review. So we've got a very different structure, which is much more informal and has been much more reliant on volunteers, although it is becoming a little more formalised.
Mostly translators, Sarah, right?
Most of them are translators.
Yeah. This is actually a question we didn't really talk about, is the involvement of translators in the active working translators in these schemes.
And informally as well, we are the house journal of the Swedish English Literary Translators Association. And talking about what New Books in German is doing for emerging translators, we've been trying to do that since we started in 1983 to give new translators a place to get into print, to get their name known. So
did you have a question as well?
Yes,
too?
I did have a question. Yes,
No.
just thinking about the time I've been editor of Swedish Book Review, we've seen the inexorable rise of the agent in Sweden. And I wonder to what extent you see these publications as a sort of second opinion on, or even antidote to, the sorts of titles that agents are pushing at you.
I think a second opinion is really helpful, actually. I think it's great when you've just been talking to an agent about a title, for instance, at the fair. If you've just been talking to an agent about a title and then you go to your meeting with the Arts Council of wherever, and then there it is in their brochure. You think, oh, right, this is one they're really taking really seriously, and there is a kind of independent viewpoint there. They don't themselves have a vested interest in that one title, but they're just saying, as a fan, basically, I really loved this book, and I find that very useful.
Well, as you said, you have an integrity by dint of your impartiality, your editorial independence, and I think that the various initiatives should make more of that, should declare that more forcefully, which is why I said earlier about naming names, telling you who has made the decisions for this particular issue of whichever magazine it is. I think that's crucial because we're acquiring editors much more inclined to trust you than indeed some of your more hypey agent colleagues.
I actually just thought of one more point, that I wanted to make more generally about the information included, was having information about translation grants, if that's something that's available in your country, is just put it somewhere really obvious and kind of in a clean page. And because I think, especially if you're targeting publishers who aren't so used to doing translations, then they really, really get a good idea on that right away.
And not only translation grants, if you're one of the fortunate ones that can also contribute to marketing and promotional costs, then please again make that very clear too, because that of course is what happens next once we make the decision to acquire.
Would you like more information and data specifically in these?
Data, I love data.
You love data.
Yeah. More data, please.
More data. Okay, more graphs. But we didn't mention we didn't speak long enough about translation. But that is actually, of course, one of the main aims of these guides is to get them translated, to promote translation. So and good translation.
I think they would all be more effective if you would genuinely believed you were reading enthusiastic translators about an individual writer or a genre. And some of the magazines, some have that editorial approach. They allow passion, if you like. Some are much more formal and dispassionate. And it could go either way, but I think actually the formal way is more likely to get results.
Unfortunately, I think we have to end it there, unless somebody has a really burning issue they want to bring up. Just want to remind you, there are lots of events here the next couple of days, a few days here in this particular translation centre, so do check the list of events that are going on and do network, because that's how all this is achieved. And I want to thank very much Bryony Everode and Philip Gwyn-Jones. Thank you so much to both of you. Excellent panel. Thank you. And do also, as Danny kindly said, put May the 16th in your diaries at the British Library. It's the European Literature Night. Bigger and better than ever. Thank you.